So, what I want to do in the next 30 minutes or so is to convince you that there is such thing as implicit rules. It means something that should be called implicit rules, and that these rules are not just marginal, but that they are quite basic from the whole viewpoint of our rule-following business and from the viewpoint of normativity of our human communities. So that's the task for me. Now let me start from the question, what is a rule? Oh, sorry. What is a rule? So when we ask this question, the first thing that probably comes to mind is that rule is something as a special kind of sentence, or perhaps a proposition expressed by a sentence, like an imperative sentence or a sentence with ought to or something like that. So we might think of sentences like no trespassing, thou shalt not kill, or the bishop moves only diagonally in the chess rule book. So this seems to go almost without saying that these are rules. Now, what I want to object to this is that we have also something, and that's, I think, is very common stuff, something like unwritten rules. Imagine you come to a community which is quite exotic from your viewpoint, and you may face all kinds of rules that nobody explains to you because everybody takes them kind of for granted, but you do not. So you see a lot of unwritten rules with which you wrestle to behave normally in the community, not to offend anybody, and so on and so on. So the objection to my objection might be, well, there are unwritten rules, but these are only rules which nobody so far has power to make explicit. So we are just marginal. Way could be made explicit and could be thus associated with a kind of a sentence. So explicating the concept of a rule as a kind of sentence or a proposition will not be affected by this. So now I must explain why I don't think this is the case. So unwritten rules. So one thing I want to suggest, and that this is not the principal objection to the previous attack on unwritten rules. The principal objection will come later, but here is also an objection. So there may be unwritten rules that may not be capable of being captured by a sentence. Well, imagine you want to learn to ride a bike. Can you be given some instructions which will teach you to ride a bike without falling down? Well, it's hard to imagine. Of course, you can be given various kinds of advices, but hardly you can be given an exhaustive set of rules which will instill in you everything you need to know not to fall down from the bike. So, and it may be similar with steering through the exotic community I mentioned before. It might be very difficult to learn to live in the community without offending anybody, without doing improper things, and so on. And we can imagine that this is something which must be learned, which cannot be Well, I mean learn by practical experience. No, learn by being told how the corresponding rules look like. Obviously, this has to do to the distinction between know-how and know that. Riding a bike is primarily a know-how, and I would say we can hardly transform it into a know that without a reminder. And the same might be with steering through an exotic community, as I mentioned before. So maybe, and I think there are rules which are too complicated to be transformed into an explicit form. So this is a kind of an objection which might be perhaps still countered. But now I will present something which I would consider a structural objection, which might be perhaps called structural objection, which I think is much stronger and much more, as it were, principle. So a sentence or any other symbolic object for that matter must be interpreted before it can serve as a rule. So if I have a rule, you ought to bow to the chief. It's of no use if you don't understand it, if you don't understand the language in which it is formulated. So if it is to act as a rule, it must be interpreted. And of course, it must be interpreted correctly. Because if you interpret the instruction, you ought to bow to the chief as you ought to spit at the chief, it's not what you need. So it goes without saying that if you have a rule in the form of a sentence, you must interpret it, and you must interpret it correctly. But this is to say that the interpreter must follow some appropriate rule of the interpretation. And this whole line of reasoning leads to the conclusion that before we can follow an explicit rule, we must already follow another rule. So this is an argument put forward not in so many words, but almost, for example, by Wittgenstein. And the conclusion, I think that the inevitable conclusion of this is that not all rules may be explicit, on pain of an infinite regress. This argument, unlike the previous one, the argument doesn't point out any specific rules which cannot be made explicit. Perhaps, or it is at least compatible with this line of argument that any rule can be made explicit, but not all rules at the same time. So this is a difference between the previous argument. Okay, so imagine we are observing an unknown community. We are observing what its people do, and we want to know whether they are following some rules. There are some rules in force in that community. So how would we do it? We know that rule following cannot, in general, be a matter of explicit rules. So not always, when there is rule following, there must be a presence of some explicit rules, like sentences or something like that. So how do we tell a behavior that is merely regular from behavior that is rule governed. We will very probably see many regularities in the behavior of the members of the society. So, for example, where may or sleep at night, or there may walk on the right side of a path always, for example, or there may bow to the chief or bow to a person which we can consider something like a chief. So we see a lot of regularities, but are there rules present? That's not clear from this here. So here I think that the difference is made by rewards and punishments. So we must see that those who do certain things, correct ones, must get rewarded, and those who do some other things, the incorrect ones, must get punished. So, for example, it's not enough for the presence of a rule when everybody or next to everybody bows to the chief. We must see that those who bow to the chief are praised, and those who don't bow to the chief are, I don't know, beaten with sticks. But we must realize, and this is a crucial point, that not every reward and punishment is so explicit like beating with sticks. On the contrary, in the life of the community, many of the rewards and punishments might be reduced to something barely observable. Punishments, for example, can be reduced to something I call social friction. So when I do something inappropriate, I feel something like a friction from from the persons around me. I feel that it doesn't go as smoothly as it should, and maybe my status in the community slightly lowers, maybe infinitesimally lowers. So we cannot imagine yet that every reward and punishment is something like being given a money or being beaten with sticks or such things. I think that these rewards and punishments, often reduced to something like the friction, are caused by what can be called normative attitudes. The term normative attitudes is very important for Bob Brandam's inferentialistic theory of language and of social reality. To my knowledge, it was first used by the philosopher of law H.L.A. Hart. So that's what I was able to find. So normative attitudes are attitudes to what people do, and it's an attitude which either encourage them to repeat what they do or somehow force them not to repeat it. Thus, the result is that behavior that is really rule governed, and I think we often use the term practices in this sense. This behavior consists of two layers: the basic layer of behavior and the overlaying level of normative attitudes. So there is the behavior, the basic behavior of, say, bowing to the chief, which is regular. But what makes it rule governed is that there is the overlaying level which causes that people prize those who bow to the chief and who do something evil to those who do not bow to the chief. As I say, perhaps beat them with sticks, or perhaps only look at them at some demotivating way. So a few words about the normative attitudes. What is crucial for a normative attitude is that it is an attitude towards kinds of behavior, rendering them agreeable or unacceptable. So if members of the community tend to beat me, I defend myself. But this is still nothing like a normative attitude. This is just my personal defense. It becomes a normative attitude when I oppose beating as such, independently whether I am involved, independently of who is beating who. So this means that it's the attitude towards kinds of behavior. So in other words, a normative attitude classifies behavior in the agent-neutral way. This is a term borrowed from Michael Tomasello. And I think it's quite illuminating. Now, when we have these normative attitudes, it seems to me that once they start to resonate across a society, they constitute the rudimentary form of an implicit rule. So when I oppose beating, it's still nothing as a rule. But if plus minus all members of my community or the great majority oppose beating, that means my attitude resonates with their. We have something as the most rudimentary form of a rule. What I find important, and to what I'm going to return later, is that a language is not needed for this kind of rules. So this kind of rules is free to underpin language. And I will show to which conclusions this leads me later. And again, it's understandable now that a rule might be a know-how, steering as clear as possible of the negative normative attitudes and invoking the positive ones. So we kind of steer through the community so as to avoid the social friction and to deserve some praise, for example, something like that. And it's such a practical business, such a know-how, I would say, as riding a bike. Now, as this workshop is also about mind shaping, so let me say a few words about mind shaping. So what I have just stressed is that a rule may exist solely via normative attitudes, which rule followers might perceive as something like the social friction or something like that. I also stress that a rule following is in this case a skill, a know-how, typically. If, of course, in some cases it can be made explicit and it can be made a matter of following an explicit rule. To be a good rule follower is to be able to navigate the social landscape, avoiding the friction as much as possible. And we do this often quite effortlessly. And this is because I think our mind leads us via passable tracks and avoids those that are impassable in a way that we need not think about this. And my idea is that we can say that this is because the mind has been shaped during our education and enculturation, so that the map it follows chime with those followed by her pairs, and together they chime with the tried and true ways of dealing with the environment. So it seems to me, and this is something I hope it's not merely a wishful thinking, that mind shaping and truth are two sides of the same coin, because it seems to me that mind shaping uses rules as a tool to shape minds on the one hand, and on the other hand, that new rules, make use of the mind being shaped in a certain way and builds on it. But this is just a kind of a digression, and let me return back to unwritten rules. I want to give you just a hint what kind of consequences this conception of rules has for me. This is my recent book, which is called Normative Species, in which I claim that when we need to characterize us humans as a specific kind of animals, then the best thing we can do is to say that humans are normative animals. This is not a new idea. In fact, I built on the idea of Wilfrid Sears. A famous quote of Wilfrid says that to say that man is a rational animal is to say that man is a creature of rules rather than habits. It was not perhaps literally quoted, but almost. So already Sears claimed it's rules that make us rational and that make us different from our kind of animals. I don't mean to say that our kind of animals do not have any kinds of rules. I was talking about the rudimentary unwritten rules, and perhaps these rules can be entertained by animals other than us. I have nothing against this, but we developed the rule following business into such a consequences that we now have courts, police, and I don't know what to underpin our rule following practices, and we have our culture and all these things we don't find at our animal kinds, at least not in the form in which we have them. So the question I asked in the book is, what differentiates us humans from our animals? And there are a lot of traditional answers. For example, rationality. Of course, this is a candidate. Well, man is a rational animal. That is a very traditional claim. Or, of course, language. Language is another thing. Morals, which are usually based on rules also. So when I am to picture what I would call a classic picture, then it looks somehow like this. Let me tell the story which may be behind this. The humans came to grow bigger brains, which made us rational. Then it turned out to be useful to exchange our rational thoughts, and we developed language. And once we had language, it turned out to be useful to solidify our communal bonds with rules, moral and others, which we now could stipulate. I don't mean to say that somebody would like to defend this picture with in this very way. This is, of course, oversimplified to the point of almost stupidity. But there are much more sophisticated versions of this story which retain the order, reason, language, rules. And what I try to do in the book is to reverse this order. So, as I show that there are rules which can make do without language, we don't need language to underpin the rules. And I think we need the other way around, the rules to underpin language, because as far as I can see, and this is something I cannot go into today, language is basically a rule-governed enterprise. And I think we don't need reason to underpin the rules. We saw that the normative attitudes, which are behind the most simple kind of rules, have little to do with reason. So the picture I want to draw is this one, which explains why I see the rules as the rule following and maintaining rules and creating rules as something which marks the most basic difference between us and our species. So my story behind this is the following. We humans started to assume normative attitudes to each other. Their resonance yielded us rudimentary rules. We interlock rules into normative arenas to which we have largely moved. So it is part and parcel of the story told in the book that we humans have largely abandoned the natural world, and we live mostly in the rule-governed arenas. In the arena of meaningfulness, we started to play our language games. So the arena of meaningfulness is one of the crucial edifices built in terms of rules by us. And playing the game of giving and asking for reasons, we became rational. So the game of giving and asking for reasons is another key phrase of Bob Brandon. I'm not sure whether it is he who coined it or whether it was already Searle's. But the idea is that reason in the strong sense of the word was born by us playing specific kind of language games, and therefore in my picture reason comes after language. But of course I cannot reproduce the whole book to you, so a lot of what I've said remains sketchy. If you need some further explanation, I might try to give it to you in the discussion. Let me just summarize what I wanted to tell you today. I think it's absolutely crucial to realize that rules cannot be identified with anything like sentences or proposition. Bob Brandon called this view regulism and rejects it. Of course, that rules or rule governedness cannot be identified on the other side with mere regularity. So it must be something in between. Therefore, I think we must admit that there are unwritten rules, and these unwritten rules are underpinned by what I call normative attitudes. The attitudes towards kinds of behavior which promote their repetition or promotes the seizing of them. So it seems to me that once we realize that there are these unwritten rules, implicit rules, and that they are crucial, we gain another view of the rule-following business, which was made so popular by Kripke and other people. We realize that rule-following might be very well something like a know-how, which I think is basically important. And we can realize, it seems to me, that rules might precede another human's achievement, like language and reasons, as I try to show in my book. I guess here is the place to stop.